In 1996, the Eastman Kodak Company was not just a corporation. It was an American institution that seemed as permanent as the government itself. It was the fourth most valuable brand in the United States, ranking behind only Disney, Coca-Cola, and McDonald's. It employed over 145,000 people across the globe. Its market capitalization stood at a staggering $31 billion. Its profit margins on film were nearly 70%, a license to print money that rivals the software margins of the modern tech giants. The company was so dominant that in many parts of the world, the word for camera was simply Kodak. But perhaps the most terrifying statistic of their dominance was this. In the United States, Kodak sold 90% of the film and 85% of the cameras. They didn't just own the market, they were the market. To compete with Kodak was considered financial suicide. They had a stranglehold on the human memory. If you had a wedding, a birthday, or a graduation, you didn't just take a picture. You captured a Kodak moment. Fast forward just 16 years to January 19th, 2012. That same company walks into a courthouse in New York and files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The $31 billion empire had evaporated. The 145,000 employees were largely gone. The stock, which once traded at over $90 a share, had crashed to roughly 30 cents, less than the cost of a single printed photograph. How does a company with a monopoly on the past manage to lose the future? The answer is not that they were blinded by innovation. It is that they saw the future perfectly, invented it themselves, and then chose to bury it alive. If you want to uncover the hidden history of the companies that shape our lives, make sure you are subscribed to Market Legends. We decode the financial decisions that build empires and destroy them. To understand the scale of the collapse, we must first understand the brilliance of the foundation. Kodak was founded by George Eastman in 1888 with a business model that was virtually undefeated for a century, the razor and blade strategy. Eastman realized that cameras were just the razor, a cheap tool to get into the customer's hands. The real money was in the blades, the film, the chemicals, and the paper. For every dollar a customer spent on a Kodak camera, they would spend hundreds more over their lifetime on film and developing. It was a recurring revenue machine. By the mid-20th century, Kodak's dominance was so absolute that they were hit with antitrust lawsuits for monopolizing the photography industry. They were forced to unbundle their services, but it didn't matter. People still bought Kodak because it was the best. The company became the economic engine of Rochester, New York, creating a middle-class utopia where employees received massive bonuses and lifetime employment. But inside the research labs, the seeds of destruction were being sown. In 1973, a young engineer named Steve Sasson was hired by Kodak. He was 24 years old, bright, and tasked with a seemingly random project to see if a new type of electronic sensor called a charge-coupled device, or CCD, could have any practical use. Sasson went to work in a backroom lab, cobbling together spare parts from around the factory. He used a lens from a Super 8 movie camera. He used an analog to digital converter from a voltmeter. He used a cassette tape recorder to store the data. In December 1975, Sasson was ready. He pointed his contraption at a lab technician and pressed the button. The machine whirred. It took 23 seconds to record the image onto the cassette tape. Then he took the tape, put it into a playback unit, and waited another 23 seconds for the image to appear on a television screen. It was a blurry black and white image of a face. It had a resolution of 0.01 megapixels, but it was a photograph, and it didn't use a single drop of chemicals. It didn't use a single inch of film. Steve Sasson had just invented the digital camera. He excitedly took his invention to his bosses. He demonstrated the device, explaining that as technology improved, the resolution would get better and the size would shrink. He predicted that one day, this technology would replace film entirely. The response from the Kodak executives is now the stuff of corporate legend. They didn't applaud. They didn't offer him a promotion. One executive looked at the device and said, "That's cute, but don't tell anyone about it." Their logic was cold and purely financial. They looked at Sasson's device and saw a threat. If people could take pictures and view them on a screen for free, who would buy the film? Who would pay for the developing? Who would buy the paper? Sasson was proposing a product that would generate zero recurring revenue. In their eyes, he hadn't invented the future. He had invented a weapon that would kill their golden goose. So they suppressed it. They patented the technology, ensuring no one else could use it, and then they locked it away in a filing cabinet. They believed that if they didn't sell digital cameras, nobody would. It was a decision born of arrogance, the belief that they controlled the pace of global innovation. But the anxiety didn't go away. In 1981, a new competitor emerged, Sony. Sony launched the Mavica, an electronic camera that wasn't fully digital, but showed the world that filmless photography was possible. Panic rippled through Rochester. Kodak's leadership commissioned a massive internal study by Vince Baraba, the head of market intelligence, to find out how much time they had before digital photography took over. Baraba's report was a masterpiece of forecasting. He looked at Moore's law, the cost of storage, and the quality of sensors. His conclusion was precise. Digital photography would overtake film, but it would take roughly 10 years for the technology to become cheap and good enough for the mass market. Kodak had a 10-year runway, 10 years to pivot, 10 years to use their billions in cash and their world-class brand to own the new medium. They had the patents, they had the talent, they had the time. Instead of preparing for the transition, Kodak used those 10 years to defend the old order. They poured billions into sustaining innovations, technologies that tried to improve film rather than replace it. They launched disc film in 1982, a flop that was grainy and hard to process. They launched the Advantix system in 1996, a hybrid camera that used film but allowed you to digitally select which photos to print. It cost $500 million to develop. It was a disaster. Why would anyone buy a digital camera that still forced you to buy film? The culture at Kodak was toxic to innovation. The company was run by chemical guys, executives who had spent their entire careers in film manufacturing. To them, digital was a low-margin, high-competition commodity business. They looked at the razor-thin profit margins of consumer electronics companies like Panasonic and Sony and turned up their noses. They preferred the fat, easy profits of film. They called this strategy managing the tail. The plan was to milk the dying film business for as much cash as possible for as long as possible. They believed they could slow down the digital revolution by sheer force of will. But technology does not negotiate. By the mid-1990s, the 10-year window Baraba had predicted was closing. The first consumer digital cameras were hitting the shelves, and while Kodak dithered, their competitors were moving. Fujifilm, their Japanese rival, saw the same writing on the wall. But unlike Kodak, Fujifilm didn't hide. They realized that their expertise in chemicals could be applied to other industries like cosmetics and pharmaceuticals. They diversified aggressively. They didn't try to save film, they tried to save the company. Kodak, meanwhile, brought in a new CEO in 1993, George Fisher, the former CEO of Motorola. Fisher was an outsider. He was a tech guy. He took one look at Kodak's labs and was stunned. The company had the best digital imaging technology in the world, yet they were using it to make photo kiosks that printed film. Fisher tried to turn the ship. He pushed for the release of the DC-40, one of the first consumer digital cameras, in 1995. But the internal resistance was fierce. The sales team, whose bonuses were tied to film sales, hated the digital products. They buried them. They didn't market them. When customers asked about digital cameras, Kodak salespeople were trained to explain why film was better. It was a civil war inside the company. The digital division was fighting the film division, and the film division had all the money and all the power. They argued that digital cameras were losing money on every unit sold, which was true, but they failed to see that by refusing to lose money on cameras today, they were ensuring they would lose everything tomorrow. By 1999, the dam broke. The quality of digital cameras hit 2 megapixels, the threshold for a decent standard print. The price dropped below $500. The internet was exploding and people wanted to email photos, not mail prints. Kodak's worst nightmare had arrived. The Kodak Moment was no longer a physical print, it was a digital file, and Kodak didn't own the digital file. As the new millennium dawned, Kodak was a dead man walking, though few realized it. The stock was still trading at respectable levels and the company was still paying dividends, but the rot had eaten through the hull. In 2001, Kodak made a fatal acquisition. They bought a photo-sharing site called oPhoto. It was a brilliant move on paper. oPhoto was an early precursor to Instagram or Flickr. If Kodak had understood what they had bought, they could have pivoted from a film company to a social media giant. They could have become the place where the world stored its digital memories. But the chemical mindset struck again. Kodak didn't view oPhoto as a way to share photos. They viewed it as a way to get people to print more photos. They redesigned the site to encourage users to order physical prints of their digital uploads. They treated the internet as a glorified printing press. While Kodak was trying to force-feed paper to a digital generation, the competition was changing the rules of engagement. In 2004, Facebook launched. In 2005, YouTube arrived. In 2007, the iPhone was released. The camera was no longer a standalone device, it was a feature in your pocket. And the photo was no longer a product to be sold. It was a currency of social interaction. Kodak's revenue from film began to freefall. In 2000, film sales dropped for the first time. By 2005, they were collapsing by 30% per year. The high-margin cash cow that had funded the company's indecision for 3 decades was being slaughtered. The company tried to pivot. They poured money into inkjet printers, hoping to replicate the razor and blade model with ink cartridges, but they were late to a war already won by HP and Canon. They tried to become a pharmaceutical company. They tried to become a document imaging company. It was the desperate flailing of a drowning giant. In a cruel twist of irony, the patent for the digital camera, the one Steve Sasson had filed in 1975, expired in 2007. Just as the smartphone revolution was beginning, the one piece of intellectual property that could have saved them became public domain. They had held the winning lottery ticket for 20 years and never cashed it in. By 2011, the end was near. The stock price dipped below $1, risking delisting from the New York Stock Exchange. The company was burning through $70 million a month just to keep the lights on. They began selling off their trophies. They sold their image sensor division. They sold their gelatin business. They were stripping the copper wiring out of the walls to pay the mortgage. On January 19th, 2012, the inevitable happened. Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The headlines were brutal. An American icon falls. The end of the Kodak moment. The bankruptcy proceedings were a garage sale of history. To pay off their creditors, Kodak had to sell their most valuable asset, their patent portfolio. In a final, humiliating auction, a consortium of tech giants swooped in to pick over the carcass. Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and Samsung teamed up to buy Kodak. Guess 1,100 digital imaging patents for $525 million. Think about that. The companies that had built their empires on the technology Kodak invented paid pennies on the dollar to own the legal rights to it. It was the ultimate transfer of power. The old guard was formally handing over the keys to the new masters of the universe. But the story of Kodak didn't end in the grave. It entered a strange, zombie-like afterlife. The company emerged from bankruptcy in 2013, a shadow of its former self. It was now a small commercial printing company focusing on packaging and industrial chemicals. It had shed its consumer legacy entirely. However, the brand name Kodak still held power, and the new management was willing to slap it on anything to make a quick buck. The rebirth of Kodak has been a series of bizarre, headline-grabbing stunts that feel more like a fever dream than a corporate strategy. In January 2018, at the height of the Bitcoin mania, Kodak announced it was launching its own cryptocurrency called Kodak Coin. The idea was vague, something about a blockchain for photographers to manage image rights. It didn't make much sense, but the market didn't care. Kodak's stock price tripled in 2 days. The zombie sat up in its coffin and danced. Critics called it a crypto grift. The coin never really took off, and the project faded into obscurity as the crypto bubble burst. But it showed that the company had become a shell, a vehicle for speculation rather than innovation. Then came 2020. In the midst of the global pandemic, Kodak made headlines again. The United States government announced a $765 million loan to Kodak to transform its factories into pharmaceutical plants, to produce ingredients for generic drugs. The stock exploded again, jumping nearly 3,000% in a week. Day traders piled in, treating the 130-year-old film company like the hottest tech startup in Silicon Valley. But the celebration was short-lived. The loan was put on hold amid investigations into insider trading and the company's lack of pharmaceutical experience. The deal eventually fell through. Today, Kodak still exists. It employs around 4,000 people, a 97% drop from its peak. It makes aluminum plates for printing presses. It makes chemicals. It even still makes some film for the die-hard enthusiasts and Hollywood directors who refuse to shoot on digital. But the lesson of Kodak is not about film versus digital. It is a lesson about the danger of success. Kodak failed because they were too successful. They were so good at making film, so profitable and so dominant, that they became addicted to their own business model. They fell in love with the solution, not the problem. The problem they solved was capturing memories. Film was just one way to do it. Digital was a better way. But because the film division paid the bills, the film division made the decisions. They forgot that their loyalty should have been to the customer, not the chemical. Steve Sasson, the man who invented the digital camera, stayed at Kodak until he retired in 2009. He watched from the inside as his invention ate the company alive. In a later interview, he summarized the tragedy perfectly. He said, "Every time I showed it to people, they would ask me, why would anyone want to look at their pictures on a TV screen?" They couldn't imagine a world where screens were everywhere. They couldn't imagine a world where a phone was a camera. They couldn't imagine a world without Kodak. And because they couldn't imagine it, they couldn't survive it. The next time you pull out your phone to take a picture, remember that you are holding a Kodak invention. You are using technology born in a Rochester lab in 1975. The only thing missing is the logo. If you want to stay ahead of the curve and understand the forces that drive the market, you need to be informed. Subscribe to Market Legends right now. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into the stories that matter.